Hi, my name is Mike Doran. I am the director of the Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East, and I'm here today with three of the finest minds on Turkish politics to help us unpack what just happened in Turkey, the spectacular victory of Recep Tayyip Erdoğan for his third term as president. And to kick it off, well, let me first introduce the panelists. We've got Svante Cornell. Svante, you are a dual national. You're Swedish and American. And we have Rich Hudson. Rich, as far as I know, you're just an American, although you're fluent in Turkish, as is Svante. And Yusuf Erim, you are a Turkish national and also fluent in Turkish. So by my count, if I include myself, we've got 3 Americans, 1 Swede, and 1 Turk. And all of you, as I've mentioned, are fluent Turkish speakers and very knowledgeable about Turkey. Let me turn first to you, Svante, to kick it off. Why don't you just give us your impressions of this very interesting race? What are your big takeaways? What are the lessons we should learn? Anything that's on your mind?
Thank you, Mike. Well, we can talk about this for a long time, but from my perspective, there are a couple of takeaways. The first is that let me put it like this, by the standards that most observers outside Turkey and many inside Turkey adopted, this was an election Erdogan should lose, given the state of the Turkish economy, the problems that the earthquake and the earthquake management showed. But that didn't happen. And then we have to ask ourselves why. And I think there are a couple of reasons. The most obvious is obviously that Erdogan has been in power for 20 years. The line between the party and the state, if you will, the line between Erdogan and his political party and the state, it doesn't exist anymore in many ways. So the use of administrative resources, the enormous financial advantage and control over the media that Erdogan possesses makes it a very tall order for anybody in any condition at this moment to win an election against him. So if you want to go back into modern history and try to find cases where a leader of the type of Erdogan has been ousted in an election, you're going to be able to find 1 or 2, but it's very rare. So I think that's the first conclusion. The second conclusion I think I would draw from this is that candidate selection matters. We talk about this a lot in US politics. And this is not something I think controversial in many ways. A lot of people who would like to see change in Turkey, in Turkish politics, for a long time have said that the nominating Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu as the candidate of the opposition was a very serious mistake. And it was a very serious mistake for a variety of reasons. One is, at the very basic level, Turkey is a center-right country, and therefore nominating a person with a center-left background might not be the smartest thing to do if you have a coalition that in any way has only one common denominator, which is opposition to Erdogan. Second, Turkey is a country that is dominated by Turkish nationalism and a country that has a fairly strongly Islamic conservative identity among many voters. Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu happens to be a member of both an ethnic and a religious minority. We may like it or not, but the fact is that I think a lot of people in Turkey did not vote for Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu on the basis of these identity issues. This is
sorry, Svante, if I can just can you just, for the benefit of our listeners, can you explain what his
Mr.
ethnic and religious background
is of Kurdish origin from the Tunceli area in central Turkey, and he also happens to be an Alevi, which is a heterodox religious minority in Turkey, which is distinct from the majority Sunni Muslims. Now,
heterodox, and correct me if I'm wrong, read by most Sunni Muslims as a form of Shiism.
Yes, that's correct. Although I would say it doesn't have really much to do with Shiism, but this is the perception. Now, the fact that Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu was polling worse against Erdogan than a number of other politicians, such as the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara, were very well known. but I think Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu had a feeling that this was his chance to become the president of Turkey. And we know that the coalition partners were not happy about this. The Good Party leader, Meral Akşener, almost walked out of the whole coalition agreement because of this, because she understood this was not a good idea. She finally came around because there was no way of stopping this, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu being the leader of the largest opposition party. So I think Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu bears a lot of the blame for not taking a step back and insisting on his own candidacy in this. That's, I think, a very serious reason why the opposition missed on this very historic chance, that in spite of all the advantages of Mr. Erdoğan, I think a different candidate could have won this election. And finally, I think we're still bad at understanding the way voters reason, whether this be in the United States, where, of course, especially Beltway and coastal elites still don't understand why people in the middle of America vote the way they do. And I think similarly in Turkey, we assume that economic issues are always the most important, and we ascribe certain rationality for people to think the way we would like them to think. But we see now that for people in Turkey, they voted for Erdoğan, among other, because of these identity issues, and also because of the image of Turkey and Turkey's role in the world that he would like to project, which is very different from the more circumspect, should we say, role that Kılıçdaroğlu would have projected Turkey to be. I just end with another takeaway, which is that winning this election came at a big cost, and I mean an economic cost. We can get into details if you like, but the shenanigans Erdoğan had to pull out of, rabbits he had to pull out of hats in order to keep the economy afloat, postponing natural gas bills to Russia, money from the Gulf, what have you. These chickens are going to come home to roost, and the economic consequences of this are something that he and Turkey are going to have to deal with in the coming years, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Svante. Let me now turn to you, Rich. And Rich, you can take this conversation wherever you like, but I'd just like to start with a reaction to Svante, and that's that we should also, I think, give some credit to President Erdoğan. He is, in my view, an extremely talented politician. Whatever advantages he has, some of them are simply his natural gifts, which are prodigious when it comes to pulling rabbits out of hats. What would you say to that?
No, I think he's a very gifted retail politician. I first want to protest vigorously at Svante taking all the good points right at the beginning.
Feel free to repeat them.
No, look, I think I agree with just about everything Svante said. I do want to focus on a couple things here. First of all, you'll hear people in the West talk about this because their expectations were not met about who was going to win, and there was the strong pro-opposition, pro-Kılıçdaroğlu sentiment. There's a sort of a feeling of disappointment. You see a number of articles. The Economist had another one talking about Turkey's lost opportunity to save democracy. The first point I want to make is this is actually, from the perspective certainly of procedural democracy, kind of a big victory. And I don't mean just for Erdoğan. There was 87% turnout in the first round, 86% in the second round. Now, Turkey typically has high turnout for the elections, but that's impressive. That is an impressive taking seriously of sort of the franchise to vote, and people went out on both sides. It was a vigorously contested, meaningful election, and that's one of the hallmarks of what we talk about when we talk about democracy. So I think the fact that you had fairly clear alternatives, certainly in terms of domestic politics, and the program put together by the Table of Six, the opposition alliance, about domestic reforms and about returning independence of institutions that they believe has been undermined, and about returning to a parliamentary system, there was a clear alternative here. And I think the fact that we had a clear alternatives, a vigorously conducted campaign on both sides, and that we had such high turnout, and by the way, also good ballot integrity in terms of the number of disputes that came up. They were all pretty secure in terms of ballots, and during their transportation and counting. Disputes arose. They had lawyers on both sides. I mean, it was a pretty well conducted election, and I think there were people ahead of time that had very nightmarish scenarios of, Erdogan's going to suspend the entire election, or he's going to do a wag the dog by a new operation in Syria, or there's going to be wholesale fraud of one sort or another. Those things didn't come to pass. So let us applaud whether we sort of emotionally and intuitively support the opposition or Erdogan. let us applaud an ally conducting a fairly well-run election. I think that matters. Now, in terms of Erdoğan, the politician, he was singing the night of the election. He even got the imams to dance on top of buses. Yusuf, I don't know if you were dancing anywhere near there at the same time, but look, the guy has a gift for reading the average Turkish voter. The evolution of Turkish democracy since 1950 with the switch to multi-party democracy has not been one of even progress. It was a top-down revolution that founded the republic, and you had this largely secular elite that has gotten used to administering the state. And every time there's been these bumps in the road, it was coups in some cases, and in others it was just very difficult elections. The late 70s was an ugly period in terms of left-right. It is a center-right country for the most part, as Svante has said. And how to regulate how far to the left and how far to the right policy can move is a contested and not always a pretty thing. So we'll see. Erdoğan has done a fantastic job of cobbling together a coalition. Remember, he started out not really as a nationalist when he was in 2000, 2001, 2002 for seeking national office. He was more campaigning on a sort of reform of the military tutelary state and on sort of peeling back military and the nationalists also, who were some of his biggest opponents early on. And he had a liberal coalition and a Western-leaning coalition. He made this big shift in 2009, 2010 because he read the mood of the Turkish people. And now he's co-opted the majority of the nationalist votes, not all of them. But this, for me, is really the story of the election. First of all, that it was pretty well run, pretty well conducted, vigorously, and it shows a 52-48 split, which reflects a lot about the electorate that I know from talking to many Turks and dealing with them. It's not the Turkish electorate, perhaps, that the West would like, but it is the Turkish electorate that has been confirmed through multiple elections. Now, I also want to say that I think that in the end, this was a contest between pain tolerance and risk tolerance. In terms of the coalition, they had the opposition coalition, they had a very difficult job bringing together 5 center-right parties. And
sorry, Rich, can I interrupt you for 1 second? But before you tell us what you mean by pain tolerance versus risk tolerance, could you just give us a quick thumbnail of what the 2 different programs were? You know, the bullet points of what, for the average Turkish voter, what did Kılıçdaroğlu represent and what did Erdoğan represent, and then give us your analysis.
Certainly. So for me, the primary points of distinction between the 2 sides. The first is Erdoğan himself as a personality, because after 20 years of ruling the country, whether he's an angel or whether he's a devil, he is the political story. And I think the one thing that brought the opposition coalition together was a desire to move on from Erdoğan. He's almost 70 years old. Voters that are first-time voters in Turkey now have not known a country that was run by any other political movement other than AKP and by Erdoğan. So it was a referendum on whether he should continue to lead, which will presumably be his last term. The Constitution calls for 2 full terms of direct election. So this would be the last unless there's another change to that. So this was a referendum on his personality, and he has put a personal stamp on foreign policy and on sort of the political machinations within the country. So it's very much about him. On terms of domestic politics, Kılıçdaroğlu and the opposition made very clear the wish to return to a parliamentary system. In 2018, Turkey had transitioned to a presidential system, which was a big change. The TBMM, the Türkiye Büyük Milli Meclis, the parliament, unicameral parliament, had been the locus of most policy making, other than that was made by the military tutelary state since the 1950s. But Erdoğan became the dominant force in driving policy decisions, a very highly personalized rather than institutionalized rule or form of rule. And that's another thing the opposition said they wanted to move away from, back to institutions, both for monetary policy, for foreign policy, all these sorts of things. Now, this ironically became something of an Achilles heel in my view, because, and this is to bring it back to what I meant between the pain tolerance and the risk tolerance. Turks, especially over the age of 20 or 22, remember coalition governments from the 90s and other periods as being very unstable. So the pain tolerance of a man that you know, who's been there for 20 years, who has made some economic decisions that are very open to criticism and who is not uniformly loved by the Turkish public, although I guess 52% perhaps. But you know what he's going to do. You more or less know with 5 years the sorts of mistakes he's going to make and the sorts of good things he's going to do. With a coalition, the fundamental question of whether it's even going to be functional is a fair question in the scope of Turkish history. So there's that. And then there's the Also, the fact that the coalition program, the opposition coalition program that they put out was very heavy on reform, but very light, for instance, on security and foreign policy. Security and foreign policy to a center-right electorate are dominant issues, paramount issues. And the fact that many Turkish voters didn't really know where Kılıçdaroğlu stood on PKK and PKK adjacent groups and on organization of Turkic states and on the war in Syria, I think lost him some votes at the end. In the contest for this center-right electorate, the center of mass being some combination of nationalist, conservative, business-oriented, and religious, Kılıçdaroğlu just did not succeed in pulling enough of those in.
Very interesting. Yusuf, let's move to you now. And my the thing that I found most insightful about what Rich just said was the movement of Erdoğan and of Turkish politics to a point where nationalism was the central theme. Nationalism and foreign policy, it seems to me, was a central theme in the election. I was really struck in watching it from afar how at one point Erdoğan even emphasized the military industrial base, the defense industrial base, as as an achievement on which he was running. Do I have that right? And what are your general perceptions?
Well, the momentum towards, or the just natural progression between the AK Party and the MHP are just conservatives and nationalists inside of Turkey is just a byproduct of the future foreign policy trajectory of Turkey. When we look at the way Turkey is going, one, national security, counterterrorism, especially against the PKK, the border with Syria, and especially furthering or advancing diplomacy and unity with Central Asia. These are all major themes that the Turkish president wants to advance, and they create tremendous synergy with Turkish nationalists. So an alliance between these two back in 2017 or 2018, very, very natural progression for AK Party, for the Turkish president. And the alliance has been very, very healthy, especially when we look at it in comparison to the Table of Six. The Table of Six, unfortunately, their binding issue, or the binding policy, was their anti-Erdoğan stance, or let's get rid of Erdoğan in this election. And to do that, Kılıçdaroğlu had to give a lot of compromises. There wasn't any conformity or cohesiveness in the messaging, especially when the chairman of each of the parties were individually speaking to their own constituencies during the campaign process. So we saw a lot of divergence in policies, not a lot of clarity. What would keep these parties together? I think that was very, very important. And that's what concerned many voters. That's why many voters ended up swinging towards Erdoğan in the second round. And that's exactly why the third presidential candidate, Sinan Oğan, ended up giving his support to the Turkish president because of the marriage between conservatives and nationalists inside Turkey. But this was just a natural progression. This was going to happen sooner or later. And since it is a natural progression, that's why that alliance is very, very healthy. Now, just to touch a little upon a couple of takeaways, I think the 25% nationalist vote that was garnered on the night of the 14th was tremendously important. When we look at MHP on Erdoğan's side, when we look at E-Party on Kılıçdaroğlu's side, and when we look at Ata Alliance, also the BDP, altogether we almost have 25% nationalist vote inside Turkey. I think this is tremendously important. This is a record high for Turkey, a record high for nationalists in Turkey. So there's a rising nationalism. This needs to be read very, very properly. Obviously, national security concerns are triggering this. The rising refugee situation inside of Turkey, over 4 million refugees. This is triggering this rising nationalism as well. So this needs to be read very properly. And is it going to be a continuing trend, or is this the glass ceiling for that vote? That remains to be seen. Now,
sorry, let me stop you there for one second, and tell me if I'm right. What I'm trying to get is, I'd like you to define nationalism with a little bit more specificity. But I'll put it to you like this: isn't the U.S. alliance with the PKK, or to my friends in the government who want to say it's not the PKK, the YPG SDF, which every Turk reads as the PKK. Isn't that one of the things that's in addition to the refugees that is driving the rise of nationalist feeling in Turkey? Do I have that right?
You have that definitely right. That's exactly what I was talking about when I said rising national security concerns. We don't, whether you want to call it the PKK, YPG, SDF, the three-letter acronym doesn't matter. The abbreviation doesn't matter. At the end of the day, a group that is creating a national security concern for Turkey, we can just very simply define it as that. And that has been a huge problem. This has created rising nationalism inside the country. And when we say rising nationalism, I never like to compare Turkish nationalism to, for example, say nationalism inside of European Union member states or nationalism elsewhere. Turkish nationalism is a little more different. It takes pride in an Ottoman heritage, so it's a multi-ethnical nationalism. It's not some type of it's more inclusive nationalism. It's not some type of Turkish superiority.
Closer to American multi-ethnic patriotism, perhaps.
Exactly. I think it would be much better defined in the United States as patriotism versus the normal generic understanding of nationalism. So I think that it gets lost in translation sometimes. So it's not this exclusive nationalism. It's much more inclusive nationalism. At the end of the day, you have Erdogan's #1 alliance partner, the MHP, welcoming refugees. Now, this is not something normally a nationalist party or a far-right party would do anywhere else in the world. So as you can see, it is a very inclusive nationalism that takes into account the Ottoman heritage and the multi-ethnicity of Turkey. Now, if you just a couple takeaways I wanted to say besides that, I saw a very important poll heading into elections. I think this is probably the best poll that defines what happened on May 14th and May 28th. In the poll, they asked the participants regarding the economy and other issues that were very concerning to voters, who's to blame? And Erdogan scored first on many of these topics. They also asked them, who's the solution? And Erdogan scored first on many of these topics. So while voters...
That was, Rich was getting at that before, yeah.
I think this is very important. While they blame him, they also understand he's the most viable solution to these issues as well. And as long as that is the understanding amongst Turkish voters, he'll continue to win the election. And that's exactly what happened. We saw a lot of narratives, Erdogan versus democracy. I don't think democracy should be reduced to an outcome. I think that's just a very naive, a very cheap understanding of what democracy is. I think the process was incredible in Turkey. It was definitely free. How fair was it? I think it was as fair as back in 2002 when a little-known party called the AKP and their jailed chairman won elections. I don't think that, to gauge how fair elections is, how fair is it compared to, say, for example, elections in Switzerland? Okay, it's not as fair as elections in Switzerland, but to gauge it inside of Turkey's own history, modern history, since the multi-party system has been around, I don't see this election as being any more unfair than any previous elections have been in the past. Also, a little about the presidential system. Many criticize the presidential system for giving the Turkish president expanded powers, a stronger mandate. But when we look at the Turkish presidential system applied to elections, we are now seeing the most diverse Turkish parliament, 15 political parties. The presidential system and having to get 50+1 was almost the undoing of Erdogan as well. If this vote took place in the parliamentary system, the old system, Erdogan would have won in a landslide. His party would have most likely a supermajority. His alliance would have a supermajority. He would have been a shoo-in for prime minister in the first round, and it would have been a devastating defeat for the opposition. So this same presidential system that the opposition is criticizing and wanting to remove is also the same system that gave them a fighting chance, because under a parliamentary system, this election was a no contest going forward. So despite all the challenges that the Turkish president faced heading into it, and this was the toughest election of his career, and despite it being a referendum on him, when we see the six-party bloc being formed against him, and their joining issue, their conforming issue being to remove Erdoğan, he was able to overcome the challenge of the pandemic, the challenge of the war in Ukraine, rising inflation, earthquake recovery. So many of these challenges he was able to overcome. He protected his 2018 vote. The opposition alliance basically consolidated the 2018 opposition vote under one candidate. They only were able to increase that vote over 5 years by 1%. I think this says a lot about the Turkish electorate. There are not a lot of undecided voters. People vote historically where they vote. So it's going to take something extra special to beat Erdoğan. It's going to take something extra special in 2028 to beat Erdoğan's predecessor as well, because he'll most likely be coming from that same ideology, representing many of the same issues. So the opposition needs to find a way to expand itself if they want to beat Erdoğan, or if they want to be the after Erdoğan as well.
Quick two-finger on the nationalist point, if I can, Mike. And
Sure.
that's just that I don't think we in the West should make the mistake also of thinking that Turkish nationalism is restricted to the MHP, the E, the BBP, the others. AKP itself has a significant number of voters who are nationalists. Even the CHP in its way has members. I think probably we should keep in mind that while it may not be the dominant issue for more than 25% of the people, the nationalist sentiment is probably much more broadly shared than that. I'd say maybe even 60%.
Yeah, I just in general, I find Turks to be some of the most patriotic-minded people that I've encountered. On that note, Svante, why don't you unpack for us a little bit the relationship between Kılıçdaroğlu and the HDP? I think American viewers probably didn't hone in on that, and I think the comments of Rich and Yusuf have moved in that direction. What I'm trying to say is there was a suggestion that he was going to be soft on the PKK. How significant was that? How real do you think that was in his intentions? How real was it in terms of the perception of him? And how did that work in terms of the electoral politics?
That's a big question. I'd like to take a step back and basically talk about the theory behind the election, if you will, or the theory behind the Kılıçdaroğlu campaign. And you've seen this in multiple elections in Turkey in the past, especially when you've had this issue rise up, which is that Turkey is a very divided society. And I would say that it's not divided into two major groups. It's at least three major groups, well, two major and one minor group, which is on the one hand, you have the, if you want to be sloppy, call it the Erdoğan constituency, the more conservative, Islamic and nationalist, but that's simplifying things because you have actually more Islamists in the opposition than you do in Erdogan's group nowadays. And then you have the, so to speak, the more secular part of society. But the third group, which we don't talk about as much, is there is a portion, and I stress a portion of the Turkish electorate, which is a very specific group that's totally outside of either the secularist or the more conservative Turkish. I mean, these are three groups that don't interact much with each other. They don't intermarry with each other very much, and so on. Of course, there are at least half of the Kurdish ethnically Kurdish population of Turkey is very well integrated and doesn't, vote Kurdish, if you will. But it's undeniable today that there is a very large chunk of the population of Turkey that, it's somewhere in the 8 to 10% range that votes Kurdish on the basis of Kurdish identity. So what do you do with this in a country that's 50-50, if you will, or 52-48? We had the Istanbul election for mayor, which the opposition won. And it was very clear, and that the takeaway from that election was that a center-right candidate was able to defeat Erdogan among many things, but very, very clearly because he was able to secure the Kurdish vote. So this led to the thinking among...
This is just to make it clear for our viewers, Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in the world. So even though it's far away from the Kurdish regions, there's a large Kurdish constituency, and İmamoğlu was able to appeal to conservative sentiment and Kurdish sentiment simultaneously. That's the argument?
That's right. That's the argument, but also it translates into the broader Turkish electorate, and especially if you have a national election. And I like to put it like this: if you are going to seek to win the Kurdish vote, what's that going to do with your support among Turkish nationalists? Now, so the question is, are there more Kurdish nationalists or Kurdish voters that you're going to win to compensate for the losses of Turkish nationalist voters? And the gambit that led Kılıçdaroğlu to take the approach that he did was that, yes, this was the right way to do it in order to get, Erdoğan and the MHP had secured such a, large chunk of the Turkish nationalist vote that the way to defeat Erdoğan was to get the Kurds behind you. The problem with that was that there was never any clarity on what actually Kılıçdaroğlu or his coalition was going to do in terms of the Kurdish question, in terms of relationship with the PKK, except, of course, release, HDP Kurdish leader Selahattin Demirtas from jail. Because he had a nationalist party as the second largest party of his coalition, which was basically running as a veto over anything he would like to do to, any appeasement of the Kurds.
Sorry, let's unpack this a little bit for the viewers who aren't following Turkish affairs closely. The coalition partner that he has is the EE party, the Good Party. Is that right?
Yes.
That's
right.
And then can you help our viewers understand what the HDP is? What's its relationship to
the
PKK?
HDP? Well, the HDP started off perceived and in many ways is loosely connected to the PKK. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that because there are strong forces within the Kurdish political or social movements that want to separate from the PKK. I would say that Erdoğan made a big mistake in his previous incarnation when he was, supporting the peace process with the Kurds by directly starting talks with Öcalan and the PKK itself, instead of trying to make a deal with the Kurdish elected representatives of the people who were in parliament and trying to separate them from the PKK. But when he actually went, and this is 8-9 years ago, and started talks with the imprisoned leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, he basically threw all the parliamentarians of Kurdish origin under the bus and cemented the control of the PKK over Kurdish life in Turkey. That was a huge mistake in my mind, but that's a different story. So now we're in a situation where the HDP is, to a large extent, because the PKK is a very violent organization that has no problem using violence against Kurds, not only against the Turkish state, in order to maintain its control and dominance over Kurdish life, and therefore, to be an HDP politician and to steer clear of the PKK is very difficult. To make a long story short, Kılıçdaroğlu, to my mind, never managed to make it clear what it is he was going to do. He created enough doubts among Turkish nationalists that they felt that a vote for him was not, as Rich was talking about earlier, a safe vote in terms of Turkish national interest if you were concerned about the PKK question. On the other hand, he did not go far enough, perhaps, in order to secure, so to speak, the enough of the Kurdish vote. And I think at the end of the day, there are so many more Turkish nationalists in Turkey than Kurdish voters, that this strategy of trying to focus on the Kurdish vote is probably a mistake.
So he tried to feint toward the Kurds, toward yes, that segment of the Kurds that
yes,
votes for the HDP, but did it just enough to alienate Turkish nationalists.
Yes.
Right. But not enough to actually secure to siphon votes away from the HDP. Is that the?
No, he did, because the HDP didn't field a candidate, and the HDP could easily have fielded a candidate in the election, and then maybe Erdoğan would have won in the first round, right? So which he almost did. So the idea was,
he didn't get enough Kurdish votes to compensate for the.
He did, because there are not enough Kurdish votes to compensate for the loss of Turkish nationalist voters.
So, in other words, he ran a very bad campaign.
Yeah.
And
that there are discussions, by the way, about the many of the calculations that were made by the CHP campaign coordinator, but then we're getting into inside baseball.
Okay, no, but very interesting. Rich, I will invite you to any reactions you have to what Yusuf and Svante have said, and then let's start move this discussion toward what it means for U.S.-Turkish relations going forward, and U.S.-European and Turkish-European relations as well.
Certainly. Well, first, with regards to the Kurdish electorate, I agree with what Svante said. There's just not enough votes there to offset sort of the center-right nationalist middle that you forego if you try to show a preference or sort of privilege to the Kurdish issues. The other thing is the Kurdish electorate itself is pretty interesting. If you look at the results province by province, Erdoğan actually won, I think, 4 different provinces that are predominantly Kurdish, including Şanlıurfa, Bingöl, Elazığ. I think it's pretty mixed, but I think it does have a slight Kurdish majority. And in at least a half dozen more of the heavily Kurdish southeast provinces in that area, AKP won between 33 and 48%. That's a pretty strong showing. And to be a little provocative here, if we're going to call Istanbul the biggest Kurdish city, of course it's a predominantly Turkish city, but is also the biggest Kurdish city in the world. AKP, in a sense, is the biggest Kurdish party in the world. Several of the AKP founders are ethnic Kurds. Many of the people in southeast Turkey are business associates who like the Barzanis. They can do business as Turkish businessmen with a Kurdish ethnic identity. If they want to live as a person whose multi-level identity includes Islam, perhaps a tribal identity, Turkish citizenship, and to put it neatly, I have a friend who's a Kurdish AKP guy, and I asked him one time, as a result of the PKK violence flaring up in 2015, 2016, do you feel any difficulties being an AKP supporter when Erdogan's going after the PKK so hard? And he says, no, look, this is not that simple. PKK has its own interest group. It doesn't represent all of the Kurds. It is an interest group. He says, but me personally, I am ethnically a Kurd, I am religiously a Muslim of the Shafi sect, and I am politically a Turk. And I see no contradictions among those things. So you have to convince me. You can't just say based on my ethnic identity that that's going to determine my politics. There are somewhere north of 70,000, 75,000 village guards who are a security force that's overwhelmingly Kurdish that works for the government of Turkey, far more than the number of active combatants for the PKK in Turkey. Yeah. There are muhtars, there are village headmen, there are political operatives. There's a whole infrastructure, politically speaking, of Kurds who support the AKP. So there is a competition there. And this idea that, well, if Kılıçdaroğlu or anybody else only got 6 or 8% of the Kurds, a little bit more, and he'll be able to squeeze out the rest, it ignores this distinction among the different varieties of Kurds in Turkey. There are some that simply never will vote for PKK-aligned parties, no matter how much you privilege the Kurdish issues. So I think if Kılıçdaroğlu made a mistake here, I would say it's not disambiguating Kurdish concerns from perceived sort of proximity to or adjacency to the PKK and its aligned parties, because you have to do both. If you want to win,
that's a very interesting nuance.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, Mike. The nuance often passes between us unnoticed in our conversations. So,
I normally don't do nuance, but that one's interesting.
No. So here's another thing I want to say on the second part of your question, which is turning to foreign policy and, where do we go from here? This is going to take a formation of a cabinet. We still don't know who exactly is going to be occupying what positions in Erdogan's government moving forward. Probably some of the familiar faces will stay, and in some cases that's a good thing. In some cases it may not be. I think that he will feel confirmed by the election results in 2 things. First of all, in sort of a hard security carrot and stick approach, where he has established certain red lines through being pugnacious enough to get involved in Libya, get involved in Syria, to prosecute the war against PKK. He's going to feel confirmed by the voters that these hard power nationalist concerns, but coupled with follow-up adaptive diplomacy, trying to turn battlefield results and deterrence into business deals and into sort of on-the-ground agreements. So he's reaching out to Armenia after having helped Azerbaijan in the war over Nagorno-Karabakh. He's working with Egypt now, outreach to Egypt to try to settle in Libya what in 2020 these countries were on very different sides. And I think we're going to see that this combination of being willing to swing the hammer, but then to come back and try to turn that into political results is going to persist. A second thing is he's been involved in this great power competition through a balancing and hedging position, right? I think of it not as totally non-aligned or sort of free agent among the big power blocks, but maybe 51% with NATO and the West and 49% in a diversified portfolio that includes relationships with Russia, with China, with the Gulf states, and so forth. I think that balancing, whereas Kılıçdaroğlu had said, I'm going to fundamentally realign and bring us much more closely in coordination with the West and with NATO. I'm going to reorient foreign policy. I think that Erdogan's going to feel that this sort of multi-axial approach has been confirmed as representative of what the Turkish people want. Now, here's where we get to the opportunity, though. I think that Erdogan, coming into his, what will have to be his final term by constitution, and also not a young man, he'll be 70 soon. And so I think, he can't do this forever. He's got some things now, as he goes from 20 years more or less in power as prime minister and president to fulfilling a quarter century by the end of this upcoming term. He's going to have some legacy concerns. He's going to want to have a resolution in Syria that both gets the YPG off the border and allows a large number of Syrians to go home in safety. He wants to be a peacemaker. We've seen this before, not just with Ukraine, Russia, but in the Caucasus and in even between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that his desire to cement legacy as a statesman as he approaches the end of his natural political life is going to be something that the United States should carefully consider and find places where we can work together. Washington has given what we might call the Heisman treatment, the hands distance, certainly for a year heading into this election, hoping that they could wait out Erdogan and that he would simply move on. That's not going to happen. So Washington needs to think now about which opportunities, which of these conflict areas can we fundamentally work together with the Turks on? And it doesn't mean just asking them to do task A or task B, but developing a joint vision for how we can all help to resolve some of these regional problems. I think that's going to be the primary opportunity for Washington in the upcoming term.
That's great advice. Now, Yusuf, let's get your view on this. President Erdogan, in particular with the United States, President Erdogan campaigned on retaining this hedging between Russia and balancing between Russia and the United States. That gets a lot of criticism here in Washington, but there's also a lot of opportunity in it, as Rich is suggesting. What would you recommend? You can put your recommendations either to President Biden or to President Erdogan, however you want to play it. What would you recommend as the way forward in order to create a more productive cooperation between the United States and Turkey?
Well, first of all, I agree with Rich that legacy building projects that serve legacy building issues that can be solved that will add to legacy building will definitely be a core concentration of the Turkish president's next 5-year mandate. And of course, getting a new 5-year mandate lifts a lot of uncertainty regarding Turkish leadership. I think that between the relationship with the United States and Turkey, this was definitely very important to lift that cloud of uncertainty going forward, because especially over the past 6 months, the stagnant relationship had basically come to a stop. Now, there's a lot of opportunities inside of this legacy building that the United States and Turkey can work towards moving forward. Before I get into the international part, just to fulfill the whole understanding of legacy building, I just want to quickly touch on the domestic parts. One will be the creation of a new constitution, writing a new constitution. That's going to be very important for the Turkish president. As part of earthquake recovery and making Turkey more earthquake resistant, we're going to see a major return to the urban transformation project, I think, and we're going to see a lot less opposition and resistance to the urban transformation project, because the earthquake is fresh in everybody's minds. So I think that's very important. The refugee issue will be very, very important domestically as well. And also the national fighter jet project, this will be very important. Now, let's get into the areas where Turkey and the United States can work together. And I think that as we mentioned these opportunities or identify them, I also think that was very important for US President Joe Biden and also Secretary Blinken to congratulate Erdogan very early, being the first half or the first quarter of leaders who congratulated Erdogan rather than the last quarter. So I think that opened up some diplomatic space right now, created some goodwill between Ankara and Washington, where they can sit down and expand upon these opportunities going forward. I also think the United States support for Turkey during the earthquake also improved the diplomatic environment for further dialogue. And I think that's also going to play out well after elections. Now, inside of legacy building, number one, I think obviously the war in Ukraine, I think this is very, very important. This is something that when we look at all the diplomatic breakthroughs in the past year and a half in the war in Ukraine, the Turkish president has had his signature and his name on them, whether it be the trilateral between the foreign ministers at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, whether it be the grain corridor deal, whether it be prisoner swaps, whether it be from a security perspective, Turkey invoking the Montreux Convention. These are all very important, and they not only require Turkey diplomatically, they require Turkey geographically. You can't take Turkey out of the Ukraine-Russia equation because geographically, it is basically a precondition for any diplomacy or security to work. So it is not a variable, it is a constant in any type of equation that leads to a permanent ceasefire. And I think that this understanding is tremendously important, and that this is definitely an understanding that needs to be established both in Washington and in Brussels going forward, that if there's going to be breakthroughs in Ukraine, Erdoğan has to be at that table, not just because he has a relationship with both, but because of the prime real estate that Turkey holds with regards to anything that happens in the Black Sea or regarding Ukraine and Russia. Now, again, another very important issue that can create some opportunities, I think should be a major interest, not only for the United States, but also the transatlantic alliance. I think maritime issues with Greece, especially in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, Erdoğan has a new 5-year mandate. Mitsotakis has a new 4-year mandate. I think both of these mandates coming in sync with each other simultaneously has created a very good opportunity for them to be able to create some more meaningful and serious dialogue going forward, because
Very
that
interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Both leaders looking for legacy. This could be a real opportunity.
Well, first of all, we need to remember this. Throughout President Erdogan's career, Mitsotakis is the 8th Greek prime minister that he's had to deal with. But now he will be the longest serving Greek prime minister that he is dealing with. So first, he's not a stranger. Plus, there's now some stability politically on the Greek side. So this can create some perpetuity in the dialogue that was already created over the past couple months since negotiations started to reopen again between Turkey and Greece. And I think this is a very important issue. More for NATO than the United States, because any type of deal struck between Turkey and Greece on maritime issues just really effectively creates a force multiplier for NATO, because you have these very two critical allies that would be working together, that have established a very clear-cut border between each other, that have established diplomacy amongst each other, and that would be a huge worry off the minds of not only the U.S. president, but also the NATO Secretary General going forward. And I think now is the time to do this, because that would be a legacy for the Turkish president, being able to lift this nagging issue and take it off of Turkey's foreign policy plate and be able to say, I was the one that brokered this deal. That's not an issue anymore.
So,
I think.
Sorry, before you move on. So if I understand you correctly, your first item with Ukraine, you didn't say this, but I think it was implicit in what you're saying, is that Erdoğan is one of the few leaders in the world who's kept a line open to Putin, and that and that he can play potentially a key role in brokering a ceasefire in the war. Is that your thinking?
That it can't happen without him. It can't happen geographically without him. It can't happen diplomatically without him. He's an essential part of any type of diplomacy that's going to go down in the war in Ukraine.
So okay, so we've got potential ceasefire in Ukraine. We've got potential generational accommodation between Turkey and Greece. What else is on your list?
A couple more things on my list. I think also very important for the Turkish president is going to be Central Asia and Azerbaijan. I think one of the most important things is opening up the Zengezur corridor. This is something that has always been an ambition of Turkey, having a direct landline into Azerbaijan that would connect Turkey to the Turkic world. And that Turkic
Sorry,
world
just
unity.
just 1 second for our viewers who aren't following this really closely. The Zengezur corridor being an economic and transport corridor across from Azerbaijan proper, across Armenia to Nakhchivan, the Azerbaijani exclave, and then on to Turkey, and that as part of a middle corridor that stretches from China through the Central Asian Turkic states all the way to the Adriatic. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying now. Again, the Turkic states, just for viewers who are watching, are the Central Asian states that have a Turkic heritage, a Turkic culture, whether it's Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. So a very important geographic bloc, a very important ethnic bloc, a very important economic bloc, and very up and coming. And the Turkish president, definitely part of that legacy would be to really bring these countries together. The organization Turkish States is an umbrella organization that brings all these countries to the table. And they, inside of their Vision 2040 plan, is a passport-free economic union, almost similar to the European Union, maybe not as ambitious yet, but 2040, if the goals are met, we may see more ambition going forward. So that's a very important geography for the United States, a geography that's very hard for the US to penetrate. And inside Erdoğan, a potential legacy of really bringing that bloc together creates tremendous opportunity for the United States to increase and advance its diplomacy on post-Soviet soil. So when the United States enters that region unilaterally for diplomacy with these actors singly, it requires a lot of trust to be able to create that relationship. And that's something that the United States can really benefit from by supporting Turkey in that region and by having Turkey support the United States in that region as well, because you have two other very big actors that take up a lot of legroom in that region. Russia, obviously, because of its Soviet history, and China because of its economic clout in that region. So even when Turkey treads into that region and tries to expand its influence, it treads very carefully because China and Russia are also filling up that space. So a little United States power behind Turkey would definitely make Turkey walk forward down that path with much stronger steps going forward. So I definitely don't think the Turks would mind having more US backing in that area. And this would also give the United States an opportunity to be able to penetrate a region that will be very strategic going forward because it is post-Soviet soil. It does border China, very important strategic areas. Also, United Nations reform, an important part of the Turkish president's rhetoric is the world is bigger than five. He wants to work on United Nations reform. He wants to see the UN Security Council expanded. He wants to see Turkey have a seat there. He wants to see countries like South Africa have a seat there, India have a seat on the council. I really do think it's time that the United Nations Security Council is expanded. Just to add a little on the Zengezur corridor, we're in an era right now where the logistics supply lines and the transport corridors are being rewritten, most likely for the next century. So what happens in the next 10 years as these trade routes are established, they'll probably be in place for the next 10 years. And the countries that have control over them, that have influence over these trade routes will be very dominant in global international trade. So you have the US with Build Back Better. You have China with Belt and Road. The EU has its own initiative. Now, if you open up a world map and you look at where Turkey is, it's basically at the center point. It's like the center of a web where everything converges on, because you're linking Asia to Europe, you're linking Africa to Asia, you're linking the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean onto the Atlantic. I mean, a very, very prime real estate. So this creates tremendous opportunities for US and Turkey to work together on building these international trade routes. And also, Erdoğan has expressed that he wants Turkey to be an energy hub. Now, I know we talk a lot about hardcore geopolitics, but we should also talk about energy as well. And being a global energy hub requires having many sources of energy available for consumers, where Turkey can play a market pricing role, that not a transit country, but a market mover, a market pricer. And part of that is having important storage facilities. Part of that is not just having natural gas and oil, but also having LNG. And the US wants a bigger pie of the LNG trade in the region. So I think that this creates tremendous opportunities for Turkey and the United States not to work together, but even beyond that, partner up on LNG in the region. So I think that creates a lot of energy opportunities, a lot of trade opportunities for U.S. countries, because energy diplomacy is very important. And that's the only way that the United States can really get countries to wean off of Russian energy. So having an important LNG presence in the region, not just through transport, but through direct storage, where it can come and go very, very quickly and meet the needs of allies, very, very important.
Well, thanks, Yusuf. Let me just unpack for the viewers, or let me summarize for the viewers what you said, and then unpack one thing. You said Ukraine, you said Greece and Mediterranean, Greece and Turkey. You said Security Council
Azerbaijan
reform. You said Central Asia, and when you said Zengezur corridor, you're also suggesting, if I'm not wrong, that Turkey can play it. The precondition to all that is, of course, normalization with Armenia, and Turkey and the United States playing a role to broker finally a peace settlement between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Am I right about that?
Definitely. The Zengezur corridor will require a lasting peace, but it'll also require security against Iran as well in the north, to where Azerbaijan is, because obviously any type of corridor will definitely cut into or take a bite out of Iran's off the books trade going through Armenia towards Russia. And that's something that the Iranians have very explicitly protested against. So this will definitely create a little tension between Iran and Azerbaijan, probably, which will also culminate in some tension between Turkey and Iran as well. So there's going to have to be a security dimension to the creation of the Zengezur corridor, or whatever. I know that sometimes the word corridor alienates Armenians, thinking that it's some extraterritorial passageway. So let's not call it the corridor. Let's call it the passageway. Let's call it whatever we need to call it for people to understand that everybody wins.
I don't have the text of the trilateral agreement in front of me that that Prime Minister Pashinyan signed, was a signatory to, with President Aliyev and President Putin, that ended the war in 2020. But the Armenian government has agreed to passageway, corridor, or whatever already. So that shouldn't be that hard, I say with a smile. Okay, let's have a quick lightning round, and then we'll close this out. Just closing thoughts, but as we close, I would like you to address, Svante, one thing that Rich said, which I thought was very interesting. Perhaps it was you, actually. I think it was you, that there are more Islamist parties in the opposition than there are in Erdogan's coalition. And I just want to stress this, because you never hear a discussion in Washington, D.C. about Erdogan without all of this discussion of Islamism, Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't see any of that in the election, or enough of it in the election to really comment on it. How is it possible? What is this guy? How do you define him? If not Islamist, how do you define him? Svante, that's to you in a lightning round. Have we lost Svante?
Well, I think, first of all, so my point is that, no, I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay. So my point is that Erdogan, I belong to the group of people who've written about Erdogan and as an Islamist, and I think his early career, certainly from 2007 to 2013, Turkish foreign policy was dominated by Islamist ideology that he and Davutoglu, by the way, who now belongs to Kılıçdaroğlu's alliance, were trying to peddle around the Middle East. Now, we've talked about this earlier. Erdoğan has become a nationalist, I think, not because he at heart is a nationalist. He's what in Turkish would be called an ümmetçi, somebody who believes more in the commonality of the Muslim Ummah rather than the Turkish nation. But he has been co-opted by the nationalists in Turkey, in the state and also in the political system, because he understood that his attempt to Islamize Turkish society has failed. Turkey is becoming more secular society. The kids of many of the Islamists are defecting. They're becoming departing from the ideology that their parents would like them to have. But nationalism is a predominant ideology in society, and in order to stay in power, Erdoğan has accommodated to this reality. And that's why you see now a situation where the Saadet Party, which is the old school religious party that Erdoğan and his friends split from 25 years ago, they're now supporting Kılıçdaroğlu. Davutoğlu, who many people in the West like so much, who is a diehard Islamist, if you read his books, he's now supporting Kılıçdaroğlu, which is why many of my Turkish friends would have said that if Kılıçdaroğlu's coalition would have won the election, it wouldn't have lasted more than a year or two because they have really nothing in common.
Okay, Rich, final thoughts for us on that subject or any other one?
Well, like Svante said, he's an adaptive politician, right? And he read the tea leaves pretty well. It's a different Erdoğan in 2023 than it was in 2013 or in 2003. I think the enduring streak of pragmatism that's there does leave some doors open. I think Washington has generally felt for the last 5 or 10 years, to the extent that we can talk about a city feeling, we'll say the policy consensus in Washington has been, we don't need Turkey. Right, they've become too difficult. They've become, not a great ally. They're constantly on the verge of economic crisis, and they're constantly on the chasm of full autocracy. I don't think any of it's actually true. I don't think that Turkey is that different now than it was. It's incrementally different in terms of the political and economic maturity, strategic independence. But this is the same Turkey in many ways that it has been since the 70s. And just go back and read the newspapers if you want to understand how unattractive Turkey was for the United States then, and vice versa. These very, very different allies, and there's a lot of tensions that are inherent in the relationship. And find me a Turkish leader, including Bülent Ecevit or any other, who's been real easy for the United States to deal with. They just don't exist. And Ataturk, for whom I feel the greatest respect, also was very wary. He wanted to be of the West, but not fully in the West. Right, he's a Westernizer, but one who wanted, in the way that most Turkish nationalists still want, to be their own version of it, their own brand of it. So I hope, the great hope for the bilateral relationship, now that we know Erdoğan's not a variable for the next 5 years, is to go back to some of our own roots in pragmatism. We've worked with Turkey and Turkish politicians with whom we have little in common at the ideological level very effectively for large swaths of the relationship during the Cold War, during the 90s and so forth. I would like to see, especially in our beloved United States Congress, a streak of pragmatism come in and find some of these things that Erdoğan, for the legacy reasons we talked about, wants to do the right thing on. And even as it is viewed from Washington, it's going to be the right thing. Peace between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis would be one. Some kind of stability in Libya and a conclusion to the Ukraine war. But we're going to need to work more closely with them, and I sure hope we do.
Can I throw in a quick 2 fingers, Mike?
Sure, absolutely.
I in principle agree with Rich with one modification, which is that a big change has happened in Turkey, which is that significant parts of the elite, and I'm talking about the intelligence, military, security elite, and so on, see the United States now as a threat to the Turkish state, not as an ally to the Turkish state. That is different. That is different compared to what was before. And the United States has to do something about this. This goes back to the fact that the coup by the Gülenists in 2016 and the support for the PKK affiliated Kurdish groups in Syria happened at the same time, which really was a sea change in Turkey, and we don't still understand the extent to which that has affected Turkish decision making.
Yeah, it's to me, it's shocking how ham-fisted we are in that regard. I would put the responsibility entirely on us to rectify that that situation. But I am an unabashed supporter of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. One of the things that really struck me in watching the election results was the number of countries of popular constituencies outside of Turkey who rallied and cheered on Erdogan's victory. I'm talking about in Azerbaijan, in Central Asia, in Sarajevo, in Africa. I saw groups going out into the streets spontaneously and cheering him. And this is not, by the way, constituents who were Islamist, who are responding particularly ideologically. They are feeling, in my view, Turkish power moving into areas where either Russian or American power has receded and moving in a positive way. And I see nothing but opportunity for the United States in that. Yusuf, let's close with you. You've got 3 minutes, and then we have a hard stop here. What do you want to leave us with?
Okay, well, a couple of things I want to touch on. First, the relationship with Russia. This is not going to change for Turkey. It's a Turkish interest. It has to live with Russia. Russia is on Turkey's borders. So I think the U.S. needs to understand that it needs to give Turkey some flexibility in its dealings with Russia, but it's not going to abandon Russia for the United States, just like it's not going to abandon the United States for Russia. So I think this understanding, and when U.S. policy is being drawn up for the region, it has to take into account some flexibility for Turkey to be able to operate and be able to further some of its interests with Russia. I don't really see any major national security concerns being brought up by the Turkey-Russian relationship. That being said, I want to touch a little on the S-400. I think the S-400 is also an issue that is going to find a resolution for itself in this near period. And I think, very simply, patience. It's going to solve itself. This is something that the United States should not do anything upon. It should allow the Turkish local defense industry to continue developing itself. The Siper, the locally manufactured air defense system, is slowly coming into inventory. The Hisar low altitude, the O, the Hisar A, medium altitude, and the Hisar U, the high altitude defense systems, are coming online and going into the Turkish inventory as well. The S-400 will slowly be not obsolete, but not a critical piece of hardware for the Turkish military anymore. And I think that if the United States does not bring this to the agenda or does not yell about it, that it will very quietly be retired and fade into the pages of history. This won't be a pro-America move. This won't be an anti-Russia move. This will specifically be a move to support the Turkish defense industry. And that's how most likely it will be presented as when that time comes. So I think that's an issue that's going to solve itself. Now, regarding the relationship between Turkey and the United States, we always hear these fancy words, reset, rethink. I don't think we need either. I think we need a re-identification of the expectations and the responsibilities that each country has towards one another and also towards the alliance. Turkey is now a regional power. You can't treat it or give it the role it had during the Cold War. Neither the Cold War conditions exist today, or Turkey is much stronger, much more capable. So when the United States or NATO is preparing policy in this region, it has to take into account Turkish ambitions, Turkish capabilities as well. Turkey has to be on the table when the master plan is being drawn. A plan can't be drawn with a prescription handed to Turkey saying, this is what we're expecting of you. It has to be done together at the table. As for Erdoğan and Biden, Erdoğan is a leader that likes leadership diplomacy. This is how he is. I know this is unorthodox for the United States. It likes to work through institutions, but he's a 70-year-old man. He's been head of state for 21 years. You're not going to teach him something new, or you're not going to change him. So be face-to-faces, that handshake, that promise, that word is bond is very important for him. He's an old school leader. This is how things are done. So for this relationship to be able to move forward, we're going to have to see some leadership diplomacy. I think it was a big step congratulating Erdoğan by Biden. Hopefully that progresses and we can see some leadership diplomacy actually further some of these bilateral interests going forward. That remains to be seen, but hopefully we can, because there are core interests, there are security interests, there are economic interests, and these can easily be forward with some face-to-face diplomacy, with some phone-to-phone diplomacy, but it's going to have to be on a leader-to-leader level. And one more last thing, I want to talk a little about the shift to Asia by the United States. This is something that's been talked about for a while. When will it happen? We don't know, but we've heard Trump talk about it, we've heard Biden talk about it. So we can now assume that It is a bipartisan policy, which would make it a U.S. state policy, not a U.S. government policy. So it will inevitably and gradually happen over the years, probably much slower than was initially marketed or initially presented, which spooked many countries and allies of the United States throughout the Middle East. But I also think it bore a lot of positive results. First, it taught regional countries that they need to have regional solutions, that it created a wave of normalization in the region between Turkey and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Turkey, the Al-Ula summit that unified the GCC once again, Turkey and Israel getting back at the table, the Abraham Accords. I think all of these were byproducts of understanding that there's going to be a post-American Middle East, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, maybe next century, but it's coming. So everyone is now slowly preparing for that day. And I think a byproduct of this will be a regional security mechanism that will be created. And this regional security mechanism, it won't be an Arab NATO. It'll be bigger, but it will also not be completely inclusive. It will take the major powers in the region that have the capabilities to be able to provide that regional umbrella of security. So I'm assuming that we'll probably see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, but they're not going to be able to do this without Turkey and Israel on board as well. But we're going to one day see a regional security mechanism, and that's very important for the post-American period, because America needs to be at least have influence with this regional security mechanism. That it's inevitable. You can see where X marks the spot. It's going in that direction. There needs to be the understanding.
And the week after that, we'll have world peace.
We have to no, but we're gonna have to end on that beautiful note. I don't see it as pie in the sky the way Rich just suggested, because you were providing music to my ears, Yusuf, when you mentioned the Turkey, Azerbaijan, Israel triangle, which I think, just like you say, is going to be important for the United States.
Yeah.
I'm here to advocate for that.
I've been talking about a Turkey-Israel rapprochement since 2017. It was tremendously unpopular then. I said it was inevitable. You can't stop it. It's coming, because it's not just a bilateral. It's a regional convergence. And when there is a regional trend in geopolitics, every actor needs to get in line and move with that trend, or get left behind in the rising tide. It's not a coincidence that all these normalizations in the region happened at the same time. Every one of these actors.
I totally agree, but I gotta close this out. We're up against a hard time stop here. These are great thoughts, and I hope to have the three of you back, and we'll explore them further once we see the Turkish government come together and we see the direction of things. Thank you, guys. This was a very, very informative, upbeat discussion, and you put some very positive agenda items forward. I really appreciate it. Svante, you're a Swede. We didn't talk about Sweden and NATO, and I didn't do that because I'm so bored of hearing about it. I wanted to have one event in which it wasn't mentioned, and look at that. I just ruined it. I mentioned it. Okay. Thank you very much, guys. Hope to see you back. Take care and goodbye.